If your heart's a stereo, it's going to love this episode. I'm John Paulus. You're listening to Life's Potluck Buffet only on YouTube. If you're enjoying Life's Potluck Buffet, please subscribe. And if you've subscribed already, thank you so much. I truly appreciate it. And if you have a Brave browser, you can contribute basic attention tokens to Life's Potluck Buffet with John Paulus on YouTube. Thank you for your support, and thank you for listening. Today's episode of Life's Potluck Buffet is about everything in stereo in our lives. And we're going to ask the cards about how to live life in stereo later on in the episode. But first, a little bit about stereo. Well, where does stereo come from? To learn about the beginnings of the idea of stereo, we're going to have to roll it back to the 19th century. And so please join me on that trip. Okay, so here we are. It's the 19th century, and all sorts of ways of projecting images and capturing images that will now call photography is out and about, and people are really interested in these things. And there's all sorts of new technologies arising to do with images. And one particularly interesting one that has a major bearing on the history of stereo, and that's the stereoscope. Well, what's a stereoscope? A stereoscope is basically if you think of a pair of binoculars, and remember the word binocular is going to be important here, coming up soon. You know binoculars, those field glasses, you may call them wherever you are. I don't know where you are in the world right now, but there are these things that are two telescopic lenses that are put together into one thing, and you look in them and you see things far away. That's I call them binoculars. In the 19th century, I think we were calling them opera glasses, maybe. So think about those and imagine that instead of two telescopic lenses, that in each eye piece of the binoculars, there's an image, a two-dimensional image that is the same thing, but from two very, 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 very slightly different angles. So the angles are just slightly different. Now, look into those eyepieces, and what you will see, and what people saw in the 19th century, is an image that appeared to be in 3 dimensions. And that 3-dimension image was the reason that this was called a stereoscope, because it's a thing that you see with a scope, and what you see with it is a thing that is stereo. And stereo comes from an ancient Greek word, stereos, which means a solid. It means a lot of other things, but it importantly means, in ancient Greek mathematics, a solid body. Most importantly, a cube. So you see how we now have the sense of 3 dimensions, because the way a lot of what we would call mathematics today, in a lot of cultures around the world, thought of things is as geometrical shapes rather than numbers. Nowadays, we think a lot in numbers because we learn to think in numbers. But when you're in a world where you're trying to explain the world that you see around you, well, you see shapes. And when you're trying to figure out the proportions between various shapes, what we would think of as being part of mathematics, you're going to do it with geometry. And if you see shapes and you're speaking in an ancient Greek language, then those shapes are called solids. And solids are stereos, and that's where we get the word in English, stereo. And it started with vision, because what the trick with the 3D stereoscope is, and the same thing with all 3D technology that involves those 3D glasses, the ones with one's blue and one's red, or they're different colors, right? They're polarized in different ways is the technical thing that's going on there. And what all of those things are doing are tricking your brain into separating out the vision of your left eye and your right eye. The vision of two eyes together is called binocular vision. And that's also the same word we use for binoculars. Although I guess binocular vision, binocular, we may say it slightly differently, which is interesting because the principle of binocular vision is that the difference between what each eye is seeing, that slight difference in what a left eye sees and what a right eye sees in an object that they're looking at together, that difference is what creates for us depth perception when our brain processes those signals. And that is why things appear to have depth, to be stereos in ancient Greek or solid in modern terms, and have three dimensions. So that's why we can see in three dimensions, is because of those slightly different angles and images that we're getting from the thing that we're looking at that enter into our eyes and hit our retina and then go get processed. And when they're getting processed, that's what that signal then produces our sense of depth in our mind, so that we're seeing in 3D. That's why when you're looking at a two-dimensional film and on a screen, and you don't have the 3D glasses on, and it's supposed to be a 3D movie, that's why you see a kind of image that looks like it's kind of both off a little bit and also off in two different colors. Look at that when you look at a video of a 3D film that is just on YouTube, and don't put any 3D glasses on, and you'll notice that that there is that weirdness, right? It's a little bit fuzzy because you're seeing like kind of double image, but the image is slightly off because it's trying to recreate, through the use of those polarized lenses, that effect of isolating each eye the way that the stereoscope isolated it by looking through binoculars. Now, if you're looking through clear glasses, then that's just your normal vision. You're not isolating one eye or the other to see slightly different images. And so the real world you see in three dimensions, but when it comes to a two-dimensional screen, you're not going to see it with depth in the same way that you see it with depth when the trick of the stereoscope is being played upon your eyes and, most importantly, your mind. So that is stereo. But you say, well, why do we talk about stereos as being those things where music comes out of? Well, this happened later on because the same principle that applied to stereo vision, where you have two slightly different images of the same object in 2D that you're then going to process separately, one in the left eye, one in the right eye, and then your brain thinks, okay, we're looking at something with depth here. The same thing is true with stereo recordings, where instead of having two different images, you have two different sound recordings from slightly different angles. And that produces the effect of depth for your ears. And when you put those two recordings together and play them together, what you get is stereo sound, what recording studios would call stereophonic recording. So stereo sound recordings as opposed to stereo sight recordings. And thus, stereo shifted from having to do with sight and vision and binocular vision and having everything to do with two-channel recordings that were played back, one to a left channel and one to a right channel. Instead of eyes and ears, they were played through speakers, and each speaker played the different recorded channel, and thus the effect of stereo was there. And what if I told you that the first stereo sound recording was a complete accident? At least the first one that we have. There probably were other accidental stereo recordings, but the first accidental stereo recording we have can be found in an archive in Bloomington, Indiana, on the campus of the University of Indiana. And that archive has a bunch of cylinders that were recorded by an anthropologist in the early 1900s who had traveled to Shanghai and Beijing. And what the person did was that they recorded some folk opera and music and all sorts of different things using 2 phonographs. And the phonographs recorded, the person put 1 phonograph near the singers and 1 phonograph near the musicians, and accidentally created the first stereo recording that we have, because we have 2 channels now that are taken from slightly different spots, so the sound is reaches slightly differently, and put together we now have a stereo recording from 1901, long before stereos and stereophonic recordings were ever imagined. So that is the story of the stereo. And so we asked the cards, how can we live life in stereo? Here we go. Yellow lemons, blue dumplings, magenta noodles, cards, tell us somethings. It's card 34. If you're staring at the canyon, you'll drive right off it. Oh, this is good. It's all about staring at things. Yeah. Cards, I really have to give it to you because, well, the audience might not know this, but I'm going to tell everyone that, and I know you want us to know this, that staring, the root of staring is the exact same root as the word stereo. That Greek word stereos, our word in English to stare comes from a word that also comes from that same root. So I see the cards were somehow listening. Okay, here we go. When we obsess about failing at something, our worst fear often becomes reality. Why? Well, think of it like driving a vehicle. You steer towards what you are looking at. If you are staring at the big chasm you fear, you tend to drive right towards it. If you look instead at the road ahead of you, you drive straight down it. So think about right now, what outcome are you most afraid of, and what is at the end of the road that you ought to be looking down? Oh, this is a great card for today's episode. Thank you, cards, as always. So think about what you should be seeing in the distance ahead of you and what you should just let pass you by. Have a great day, and I'll see you tomorrow on Life's Potluck Buffet.